Uh, this is the continuation of the EPAN and EEP Club International Panel. Today we have Brian King and Leah Erpa here, and they are here to share their experiences of being overseas and their graduate experiences overseas. And this is a little bit of a continuation because this wasn't working, or the stream wasn't working earlier, so that will also be posted later on. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask it in the chat, and we will continue on. So Brian and Leah both explained why they applied to overseas universities and some of the things that they did while applying. So I guess they've mostly answered what factors they considered, but the next question is, now that you have experience, what are some things you wish you would have considered when you applied?
Shall we keep the same order?
It doesn't matter.
If you can think of anything. Yeah, okay.
Start.
Yeah. I actually just wanted to comment a little bit about the last thing that Brian said also about these differences, maybe a bit of a recap for people viewing that as well, like the differences between the US graduate application system and the European one, or, well, I won't get into the UK and the continental European one, which are much more similar than the US, at least, is that in general it's much less intense. There's you don't have to take the GRE and things like that, and I think that was definitely a consideration. And sort of for the question, did you apply abroad and to schools in the US, or did you only apply abroad? I think it was a bit the same for Brian. Like, I just applied for this one program, and kind of I didn't really think about it at the time of like, I have a master plan. This is what I'm going to do. I said, you know what? Let's just try it. I don't think that there's ever going to be any other time in my life that I'm going to live in this country and live abroad. So I will just give it a go. And if I hate it, I'll move back home. Like, kind of the same that Brian said. If it's horrible, I will move back home. But it wasn't. And I stayed and decided to also stay for my PhD as well. And it's been really, really, really good experience. And I'm glad I've stayed. I think for me, I think it's been a really wonderful experience. I think the things that maybe the only thing that is I wish I would have considered maybe before I came here is how far I am from my family. My mom and my brother are still in Los Angeles, and that's pretty hard. It's a lot of, at the moment it is 9:30 p.m. in Helsinki. So the time difference makes even talking on the phone quite difficult sometimes. And it was pretty workable before the pandemic, actually, because it's expensive and you kind of have to budget for it. It just costs a lot of money to fly back and forth if you want to see your family regularly. But that was just something I budgeted for. And during the pandemic, I haven't been back since the Christmas of 2019, and that's been pretty tough. That's something that I didn't really think too much about when I moved abroad, but it has been difficult being so far away from my close family in Los Angeles. So that's I would say that's maybe one of the biggest problems, and something I didn't really think about when I moved here. Otherwise, it's been a pretty overall great experience, which is why I'm still living here. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, it's really hard to just have that distance, but I'm glad you're enjoying the other aspects of it.
I think I would say exactly the same thing as Leah there, that it's difficult being so far. I'm slightly luckier in that I'm only 8 time zones away rather than 10, but that's still, it's still a lot. And like Leah, I haven't seen my family in person since 2019. Well, that's not true. They were here, as it happens, Christmas and then New Year 2020. But then they went home just before things got much worse in Europe. don't know. I think one of the things that Leah said that resonated was the fact that finishing my bachelor's degree at Cal State, I had so much freedom and time. And one of the things I've said in EEP alumni events before is I feel like EEP gave me space to take risks, and not dangerous risks, but try things out and have a go at things, and to feel ready to make changes if I wanted to. So I think part of me regrets putting all my eggs in one basket, but it worked out. So I'm very happy that so I don't have any regrets in that respect. But looking back, I know that I was a bit lucky, but I don't regret that aspect.
Wonderful. So moving on to the next question. So what characteristics do you think would make somebody successful in an overseas or foreign university?
You want me to go first this time, Leah, or do you want to go first? I feel like I'm making you do all the heavy lifting.
No, okay. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I think a lot of it depends on what kind of situation you're going to be in. I think being in an English-speaking context is obviously very different to being in a context where you don't have the language. I think culture shock is a real thing, and so I think you have to be adaptable and be able to accommodate yourself to local circumstances. I don't think I had terrible sort of culture shock, but there were lots of things that I had to get my head around and get myself used to. And growing up in Los Angeles, I was used to things being that sort of way, and even in other places in America, things aren't necessarily like they are in LA. So I think somebody who's very set in their ways, someone who wants those familiarities and those cultural touchstones, could feel a bit like a fish out of water. I think you have to have a lot of independence and a lot of sense of, I love my family, I miss them very much, but I think if I was the sort of person who needed to see them all the time, then I would have been much. I couldn't have been as happy as I have been. It's not to say I don't miss them. It's not to say that I don't, love the time that I do get to spend with my family. But I'm also, quite happy sticking it out on my own and making a go of it. So I think you'd have to be a little bit independent, I think, to jump abroad. I think those would be the characteristics I would say, is just being that little bit flexible and that bit independent.
Yeah, I could definitely second the idea of being sort of flexible, and that's something that I've noticed quite a lot. Although I had quite an interesting experience because I lived in Michigan in Ann Arbor for 2 years before I moved to Helsinki. It was already a bit of a culture shock leaving Los Angeles already just there, because I had grown up and lived in LA my whole life before, But it was quite interesting because it wasn't such a huge culture shock in the first place. It was kind of a very interesting experience of being able to say, well, that's interesting. I've believed these things my whole life, but now I'm in a different context and people believe different things. Is this something that I've always believed, or things that I've thought true about the world, or ways that I've interacted with people because I want to do that, or just because everyone around me does that? So it was this really interesting experience to sort of find out more what was fit me instead of outside of the context of the place that I'd always lived, which I thought was really interesting, actually. And then when I went to Finland, it was even more of that. And I guess it is a bit the same as Brian, as I kind of put all my eggs in one basket by moving to this country. And I think I was very lucky that the culture here suits me very well. And it is very different. If you want to learn a little bit about Finnish culture, there's this great blog online called Finnish Nightmares, where it has this stereotypical Finnish guy who interacts with people, and it's in English also. It's very funny. But in general, the society here is a lot less talkative, and like, for example, you don't really like go up to strangers on the bus and talk to strangers. That's weird. And that happens all the time when I lived in California, and when I lived in Michigan, also when I was taking the bus, you just talk to strangers and it's like normal. And it's very different here. People are much more reserved. And it's maybe a little bit hard to make friends with people, but when you make friends, they're good friends. They never say, when you say, oh, do you want to go for a coffee? It could mean in California, oh, it just is a gesture. You don't actually want to go for a coffee. If you tell a Finnish person that, they say, okay, they pull out their calendar and they say, when? Let's make a date right now. And so but that kind of culture suits me quite well. I think I'm on the introverted side in California, and here I'm totally an extrovert. So but I've known people that have moved to Finland that have had troubles with this. They didn't end up staying in the country because the culture didn't really suit them. They really had a hard time making friends because they were so talkative and gregarious, and we were really needed that from other people and didn't find it here. So I would say that flexibility is key, but also maybe to recognize, let's say you move somewhere and you really have problems with the culture, to decide okay, well, maybe this isn't the place for me, and then try again in a different place. And I would say I almost had a little bit of that experience when I was in Michigan. I was in Michigan. Ann Arbor is a small college town, and it's, I'm sure, super wonderful if you're in a graduate program or an undergraduate program. But I was in this sort of in-between phase where I was doing this post-baccalaureate research program and then working as a research tech for a year. And I didn't actually really make that many friends. I made friends, but most of the people were either too old or too young for me to sort of get along with. And I still keep in contact with some people there, but I would say that my experience in Helsinki was completely different. Within the first 3 weeks, I took an intensive Finnish course when I first arrived as a master's student that they offered to the international master's students, and immediately made friends that I'm still friends with today, that I talk with almost every day. And I would say that that's also really key when you're moving abroad, is being sort of open and working to make friends in the new place that you move to, because I have friends from Cal State that I've known now for decades. So and older friends, and you really I think as you get older, it is more difficult to make friends because people get busier, they start to have families, and moving around becomes more difficult because you have to recreate that social network all over again. And I think that is super important and key to being successful when you're moving overseas, is to be have that ability to reach other people and sort of seek friends and try and make friendships, because you'll have to do that from scratch. It's not going to be people that you've known for a long time that you can hang out with. And when you apply and you're in a graduate program, that makes it a lot easier because you have people that you sort of study with and you have an automatic friend group. But that being said, actually, I ended up making friends with people who weren't in my master's program. My good friends are the ones that I met from other places at the university. So sometimes you might even get unlucky and just not really jive with the people that you're studying with in your program. And then that you need that skill again to make friends and create a social network and sort of find that place for yourself, because otherwise it can be a very lonely experience without making friends and having a social group. So I would say that flexibility and also the ability to really try and make friends where you go are the key things in my mind.
I agree.
Well, that's a lot of great insight. Okay, let's just kind of go through these questions because you answered a lot of them through this one conversation. Let's see. I guess we kind of went through a lot of these. So language wasn't too big of a barrier, do you think? Leia, sorry, Ryan. But do you think that learning the new language, learning Finnish, helped you become more involved?
So I really think it 100% depends on the country that you move to. For example, if you move to, I haven't lived in Spain or Italy or some of the Southern European countries, but from what I understand, France, you can't survive in society if you don't speak French. It's really maybe the university is okay, but like from what I understand, even in university, even I've visited Germany many times for university things and working on papers and things, and even there, it's quite difficult. Like going to the shop and buying groceries and things like that. People don't really speak English. That's completely different in the Nordic countries. In the Nordic countries, it's a problem learning the languages because people just want to speak English with you. Like all of the young people in schools, like anybody that's high school age or younger, they basically speak English because actually the markets for like importing American movies is not big enough that they dub the movies, so they just subtitle them. So people grow up watching American movies and they can speak English almost perfectly. Like my husband, who is Finnish, learned English playing video games when he was a kid. And he spoke perfect English when I met him. And that being said, it's very lucky in Finland because moving to other European countries, it's also easier to learn the languages. For example, in Sweden, it's very similar to English and very easy to pick up. Finnish is very hard. It's a completely different language group, and you have to learn everything from scratch. I worked at it because I had relatives here, and I was sort of ashamed that I didn't speak Finnish, so I can speak at a pretty okay level now. So it's not impossible, but it's quite difficult. But it really, like, it just really depends. If you're thinking about moving abroad, like, ask somebody that lives there and ask them, do you need to speak the language? Is it a problem if you don't speak the language? Do you need to take language courses? And then evaluate that with your own, like, am I willing to learn a foreign language? Do I have the capacity and the time and the effort that I want to spend on that? Because it can be a very difficult experience. I've heard from others living in a country where it's difficult, like if you don't speak the native language and you have a hard time and you don't either can't or don't want to learn the local language, it can be really difficult to make friends and this kind of thing. So.
Okay, thank you for your insight. Well, I guess taking this in another direction for Brian, do you think that there were other languages that you were exposed to when you were in the UK that you thought were kind of unique? And how did you feel about that?
I mean, I think part of the problem I think is that the UK is so much less diverse than California is. I was used to being around a lot more languages in Los Angeles than I am in England. So one of the things that I have done, especially more recently, is I've tried to keep up my Spanish. I studied Spanish at Cal State, just as a GE and at school before EEP. And so it's nice to have that kind of language learning. And also, I'm nothing like as brave as Leia is linguistically speaking. Spanish is such a gentle, easy language for an English speaker to have a go at, whereas Finnish is, as she says, totally different. I don't know. I think, living abroad, international travel was much easier. I think, America is so geographically and culturally isolated. Apart from our two physical neighbors to the north and the south, we don't really have much, although we have a great deal of diversity within our borders. Whereas, it's been quite easy to visit was before COVID, to visit France and Spain and Italy. I haven't been to Finland. I would love to go to Finland, but I've been to Sweden and to Denmark, and like Leia says, I think as an English speaker abroad, there's never been an easier time to travel, especially in Northern Europe, and I do like encountering foreign languages in other places. Although I'm grateful that I live in a place where I can speak English. Although it has to be said, the danger of speaking English in a different dialect is that your own accent gets eroded or altered over time. I remember the first time I came back to Hacienda Heights, where I'm from, and had people kept saying, "Where are you from? Where are you from?" I was like, "Over there." And my brother was the one who picked up on it first and said, "It's because of the way you sound." And so my accent sort of has modulated weirdly over time, and that can be a a bit of a loss sometimes.
Wow, that is quite interesting.
I could, if we have the time, I could comment one more thing about being a native English speaker abroad in continental Europe is actually a really big bonus. Something that I didn't really think about before I moved here. But for example, you can pick up a lot of freelance work doing language corrections and stuff because people are very happy to have a native English speaker, particularly if you're working in a specialty field like as a graduate student. You can do sort of like paper corrections and language corrections for stuff in your fields. And it's, well, to the point that sometimes people ask you, and you shouldn't do it for free. You should actually get paid for this kind of work. But you can pick up freelance work, and it opens a lot of job opportunities, especially within universities, because they're very happy to have a native English speaker that can do this sort of even not just grammar, but tone to give an idea of what sounds okay. And that's something I didn't think about before I moved abroad, but it's actually a really big bonus to be a native English speaker. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's some great insight, and like we probably wouldn't have ever had that insight if you were not here. Thank you for that.
And I would like to ask, what do you really appreciate about the culture, and how does it compare to the culture in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that I want to say is I think my parents are still horrified that I have never bought a car in my life. And, coming from Los Angeles, I drove, from 15 and a half on, and I do enjoy driving. Driving is lots of fun. And when I'm back in LA, I love driving around. I miss the freeways in a sense. But I also very much like not living in a city that is not, I mean, you're not a person in Los Angeles if you can't get around. And, I remember when I was 14, 15 at EEP, and us having to use the buses to get everywhere and, networking ourselves out and sort of working out plans to get to different places. And it was really hard. And it's nice being in a culture where I can get around very easily, and I can get between cities, and I can get around in my own city, and I can ride a bicycle and get to everywhere I need to get without having to have a car just to go and do some grocery shopping. So that's one thing I very much appreciate about where I live is not being totally dependent on a car.
Yeah, I can definitely second that. Was one of the the immediate first perks that I loved about living in Helsinki is it's a capital city, so there's always really interesting things going on. But at the same time, there are more people living in the city of Los Angeles than there are in the entire country of Finland. So the capital is only 500,000 people living there, so it's actually really small and quite compact. So you can get from one end of the city to the other in half an hour on a bicycle, which is how I commute most of the time. It's one of the most bikeable cities in the world, actually, when it's not snowing and terrible weather. So it's like I own a car now because of the pandemic and getting around and trying to avoid public transit, but you can get around so easily. And in fact, it's difficult in the real city center to have a car and very expensive for parking. So it's just like the public transit and not being stuck in bumper to bumper traffic for an hour every day was like a really big thing. But I would say the thing that I think I would find most valuable about the culture that I really appreciate here is, as I mentioned a bit before, like Finnish people it depends, and it's also changing with the younger generation, but sort of if you had to pick a stereotype of the average person, are not super like chatty, talkative people. Like they're not really ones for small talk. But the way that I find this is they are, like most people, a lot of Finnish people I know are absolutely amazing listeners. So like, I found the best metaphor I found to describe when I was discussing with a Finnish friend of mine of like, how come you don't really say anything in the conversations? When there's a lot of people talking over each other, it's like having a conversation in the US is like playing soccer. You kind of have to steal the ball from each other, and each person sort of jumps in with their own thing that they're saying. And Finnish people have a conversation by bowling. You stand in line and you wait your turn. And when you're not talking, you listen. Like you really listen to other people. Like my husband, I remember at one point I was discussing with him, like telling him something. I was reading some comic online, telling him the story, and like he was like, "Oh yeah, this is this other comic that you told me about before, and this was happening in the story." And I was like, "You were listening to me? I was really not expecting you to listen to me at all." Like, and he's like, "Of course I was listening to you. Like this is yeah." And it's a very typical like. I have found, like, in comparison, just the way that the culture is, people interact with each other differently. And the way that it turns out, I've realized that, like, I was a horrible listener. I'm always thinking about the next thing that I want to say instead of actually paying attention to the person who's talking to me and really hearing what they're saying. And that was, well, maybe one example of something that I never would have realized if I hadn't lived in this different culture and interacted with people who have a very different culture than me. Yeah.
I would just like to say that's an amazing analogy that you used about bowling and soccer. I think that's wonderful, and it's amazing advice. It's very true. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Any questions from the panel right now? Or we can move on. Continue on with our list. Okay. So what was the transition like to becoming self-sufficient in the country that you went to overseas? Was there like a stark difference between being an EEP and I know Leia went to Michigan. So was there that transition that helped, or was it really just like, oh my gosh, I am on my own now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I actually feel that when I was in EEP, I was actually quite self-sufficient, I think, already when I was a student in EEP. I still lived with my family, and when I lived in California, I didn't live on my own. But even after I graduated, I was working for a year. Even though I was still living at home, I was still quite independent because I already had a job and a salary. And then, yeah, I would say it wasn't a very stark difference for me. I was sort of used to arranging things. I shipped all of my stuff on a train from the California to Michigan and did all that stuff myself. And yeah, I have to say that I didn't really feel that big of a difference because I felt maybe already pretty independent. But I mean, I actually took a little bit longer when I graduated from EEP. I was 20 by the time I graduated, so already pretty old. So
I think likewise. I think being an EEP student definitely gave me a lot of independence. Exactly like Leah was saying, you know, I was responsible for a lot of my own day-to-day subsistence. You know, not monetarily to begin with, but then in my last year of EEP, I was at Cal State Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then working as a substitute teacher Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So that was a kind of, you know, transition phase of me spending more time on my own. And substitute teachers are very much, you know, have to be self-sufficient and be able to think on your feet. So I think coming abroad, I think it felt like a continuation of that in a sense. It was something that continued to give me that independent approach to my own life and to my own education, and to my own social life, and you know, and meeting new people and making new friends. I think everything Leah was saying about making friends and the opportunities that you've got when you're at university, when you're studying, whether undergraduate or graduate level, you do have a lot of people who are going through the same kind of thing that you're going through, and that's hugely important as a basis for friendships. It's one of the reasons why I think EEP is such a great model, as opposed to, you know, studying accelerated entry to university by yourself or with just your family to support you. I think you need peers, and I think one thing that EEP gave me was a sense of, well, okay, I need to seek these people out, and I can find them and make those, build those relationships. And so I think I was ready for it on that basis.
Okay.
Could I ask one question? Sorry. I'm also wondering, what is the social media difference like in your country that you're living in and the U.S.? Is there a lot of social media used? Can you like compare that? Thank you.
I mean, you have to remember that I'm extremely old. So I left America in 2001. So social media was, I don't think social media was a phrase. I remember a friend of mine from EEP. He was a couple years younger than me, and I think we were in touch. How were we in touch? Probably on AOL Instant Messenger. I think that was probably still the basis back then. And he was trying to convince me to join Facebook, and I was like, "This sounds ridiculous." So you have to remember that my memories of the United States are that it is pure and unsullied by social media. But I think social media for me has massively helped. I really like. I know lots of my friends have gone off of Facebook or find it a time sink, or they mute their WhatsApp conversations. But living abroad, my friends and my family in California, I really rely on things like Facebook, just seeing kids grow up. I've got friends in France, I've got friends in Italy, and seeing their lives and being able to see all that just in the kind of low-grade day-to-day stuff. I think social media there is really important, and I think it's pretty similar everywhere. I think that's the nature of social media, to be pretty universal and to cut across these kinds of cultural boundaries and to shape things, okay, in less good ways. But for me, I think it's got a lot of positives.
Yeah, I would have to say the same. I'm class of 2011, so a bit younger. So, but I'm still getting to the point where I'm like, really don't use social media that much. I'm a bit old for this. But that being said, I think I actually do a lot more social media and use social media for this science communication group that I'm a part of. Which I could send the link to later if you guys are interested. But it's like, so we have one person who's on the social media chair on our board who's a master's student and a bit younger than me, and she uses social media quite a lot. And because of this, I've gotten a lot more involved in using Instagram and to teach somebody how to teach me how to make a story. It was great. But I would say the same for Brian. I think it's pretty much the same. Like I having been back home and seeing people's social media use there, like people in Europe. That being said, it's very different if you move to, for example, in China, they use different social media platforms and in different continents around the world. But the US and Europe, it's pretty much the same platforms everybody uses: Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter. And the only big difference I would say is that people use a lot more WhatsApp and these data messengers rather than text messages in Europe, because it was only quite recently that you could even sort of not pay an arm and a leg to send a text message or have a phone call with someone that lives in a different country, even if it was like very close by geographically. So people, like I text people like that live all over Europe, in like friends with phone numbers from different places, and it costs the same thing if you use WhatsApp. Whereas when I go back to the States, like it's still, text messages are still cheaper than data plans. So people send more texts than they send WhatsApp messages. So that's I think the only difference that I would see is this messaging. But otherwise, I think social media use is pretty much the same.
That's really great. Kind of related to this, how did moving affect your interpersonal relationships? And like, did you stay in touch with a lot of your friends or make a lot of new friends?
Yeah, I think I mentioned when I moved to Helsinki, I immediately met a really wonderful group of people that I've become very close friends with. And I honestly, that's one of the reasons I stayed was I think if I didn't have good friends and people that I wanted to spend time with, I wouldn't have stayed in the country. after 7 years now of being abroad, and then plus another 2 where I was not living in California, the time difference makes it a little bit difficult to keep up with people. I think every time I go back, and I try and go back regularly, I try and catch up with folks, but it's a little bit hard to keep up a relationship if you only see people like for 3 weeks or a couple of times in a 3-week period every year, or every other year. It can be a bit hard, but that being said, when I've met up with folks that I knew from EEP that I haven't maybe really kept up conversations or talked with in a long time, like, there was one time I met a friend in New York that we were in EEP in the same year, and like it was like no time had passed at all, really. I think the friendships that I've made in EEP, I'm even if we don't see each other all the time, like I'm planning on being friends with these guys. I don't know what they have to say about it, but I'm planning on being friends with them for the rest of my life. Whenever I'm in their city, I'm going to show up on their doorstep and say hello. And most of the time, it really feels like no time has gone by at all. So I think it can be difficult, especially if there's a time zone difference. That makes even having phone calls and chats quite difficult. But you find new friends, or you have friends that you see every once in a while, and friends that you see every other day, and sometimes those friends change form, but they hopefully still stick around.
No, I think I definitely agree. I think that particularly for somebody who moves abroad, but unless you grow up in town and in a small town really, and work in that town, spend your whole life in that town, then everybody I think would expect to have not turnover, but just one's life. It's easier to be friends when you're going through the same things, and then when you start transitioning out of that, and people transition into work away from university, and then find they're going through different things, you discover that some people stay closer that you wouldn't have guessed, and other people who were very, very close friends to you at a time, you grow apart from. And I think at my, as I say, extremely advanced age, I think that just is a natural part of growing older, and I don't lament it too much. It is work, though, like Leah says, to stay in touch with people many time zones away. It's always awkward, I think, when I go back to LA and people say, "Oh yeah, we have to meet up," but they're working and I'm on holiday, so my weekends fill up very much, or they live further away, and if I don't have access to a car, all those kinds of logistic things can be frustrating. But I've had several waves of friends from Cal State, friends from Cambridge. I lived and worked in Oxford for 6 years, and I have friends from there, and people come and people go, and it is wonderful when you've got those kinds of shared experiences with people who were there and witnesses to the formative part of your life. And exactly like Leah says, when you meet up with them, and all of a sudden it's just, I know exactly who you are, and we can talk like old friends, even if we haven't seen each other in years.
That's wonderful. It's great to hear that you still feel the sense of connection even after such a long break with people. I think everyone wants that, and as you said, EEP is really helpful for building these connections. So our next question is, did studying abroad give you any new insights, just like broadly? Did you like suddenly discover anything just because you're studying abroad?
I mean, I think Leah has touched on several things there. I think you learn more about the United States as much as anything. You learn about the broader world, of course, but you also learn about what's strange about where you're from, because you suddenly realize that what seemed normal to you was very unusual. I think that's something that you see. You see yourself in a different light. I think I can definitely relate to Leah's remark about saying that in the US she felt like she was slightly introverted, and then moving to Helsinki, she suddenly has become extremely extroverted because the scale has shifted around her. And I think there are a lot of things about that, about ways that I would have described myself in America. I think living in the UK, I would describe myself differently because of the difference in the way that people behave and people the norms surrounding that. I'm very keen on making friends with people. Not I don't talk to people on the bus. I'm not insane, but I like making friends, and I think in America I wouldn't have said that I was quite perhaps that gregarious, but I certainly feel that way in the UK. Not that they're an unfriendly people. Did you discover anything, Leah?
Yeah, I think I mentioned a bit like you just said, you being in a different culture, you start to really realize things that you thought were totally normal are like definitely not considered normal in other parts of the world. And it's a good experience to sort of say, like, cultures are different and people have different norms of behaviors and what you say and how you act in different parts of the world, and what is acceptable and what's unacceptable. And you can really start to sort of get this idea of picking what's the best for me. Like I think the number one thing that a lot of Europeans would say is how friendly Americans are. I think particularly Californians also. Like, everybody's very nice and friendly and wants to be friends with you. And that's, I think, a really wonderful thing that is not necessarily the norm or the sort of default behavior in a lot of other parts of the world. So you can keep that and say that that's or the diversity in Los Angeles. Finland is and has been for a long time a very isolated country. Not a lot of people moved back here. It's really only maybe in the last 10 or 20 years that there was a lot of people from different parts of the world moving to Finland. And that kind of shows in the culture and in a sort of not wariness of people from different parts of the world, because they're just not familiar with it. Whereas growing up in Los Angeles is people from everywhere live in LA. And you just get exposed to all these different kinds of cultures and things like that. And that's something that I totally value. But on the other hand, there's all different kinds of stuff. Like, for example, I'm on the way to the university in the morning and haven't had my first cup of coffee, and I don't want anybody to talk to me, and nobody will. It's beautiful. And so you can sort of take these different parts of the culture, being a good listener, for example, and like trying to think more about what the other person is saying rather than what the next thing you want to tell everyone about is something that I like that is something I think that's really great here. And I can take that and try and sort of pick the parts of the culture that work for me and that I think are great. I can sort of take those and pull them together, and the parts that are not so great and things that I don't want to sort of stick to me, I can let those go, and you don't really see that if you're living in the same place that you've ever always lived in. You learn things by looking at the contrast of living in a new place.
Yeah, that's really great. And even I traveled during the summer, and I had like the same experience. I just saw like how different the culture was in, like, for example, I went to Spain and France, and it was very different. And so it opens you up to a new perspective. So what was the best memory you had from studying abroad?
I have a lot of memories, being extremely old. But I think I still get chills, I think, thinking about that first time that I got on a plane and left everything else behind and moved to a new country and got off that plane, and everything from that point on was totally new. That was a really, really exciting day. And then obviously there were more days of things being new, but I think that was a real watershed moment for my life. I think that's a really exciting feeling, and I think that's something I would definitely encourage anybody else to hold on to. That sense of independence and adventure that first time had for me.
Oh, the best memory I had from studying abroad. I would say maybe had to do with the people I met this one. So it takes a little bit of a preamble explaining some bits about Finnish culture. So when I was a master's student, I was living in this student housing, and I got really lucky. I had some friends who were studying in the law faculty and studied in the city center campus, and we managed to get a place that was in the city center and had a rooftop sauna, which was lovely. And sauna is a very big part of Finnish culture. It is much warmer, like very hot, and it's something that you do with your friends, you do with your family. You start doing it when you're very, very young, and particularly do it on days that are holidays. So I think one of my favorite memories is this meeting with these like wonderful group of people that I had met, and we all got together on the 1st of May, which is a huge holiday here. It's especially in the universities, the universities celebrate it quite a lot. So we had a party on our rooftop sauna and just like hanging out with friends and having a great time and watching the sunset from this like beautiful terrace that we have. Now I'm not a student anymore and get to live in the fancy student buildings. So now I've got a basement sauna. But I think that's definitely one of my favorite, my best memories was like with these great group of people that I met, having a great time at this, sweating together in a little tiny room and then enjoying this rooftop sauna. Yeah.
That sounds really amazing. So would you recommend this experience for someone else?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I would definitely recommend the experience. I think you have maybe a little bit of a selection bias by asking me and Brian, because we're the ones who stuck here, right? And I, for example, I've known people that have had maybe not so great experiences moving abroad. For example, the one of the worst parts of living in Finland is it's super dark, and like 2/3 of the country is in the Arctic Circle. So between like November and January, there is no sunlight. We get sunlight here in the winter in the south, where the capital city is, but it's kind of miserable. You get it back in the summertime when the sun never sets and it's magical, but you pay for it in the wintertime. So for some people, I've known folks that have moved here, and like seasonal affective disorder is a thing, like to some extent for everybody. And some people I knew one person who moved here and ended up after 1 year moving directly back. Couldn't really, like the culture didn't jive well with them. They were not really a gregarious person and had trouble reaching to other people to make friends, and were very lonely. And then it was very dark in the wintertime. And so I think what I'm saying is, like, me and Brian, we landed and we stuck, and it worked out well for us. But it's also possible that this experience, you don't drive well with the place that you land, and it doesn't really fit you, and you don't suit well or don't make friends. But I think even in that sense, it can still be a valuable experience. It might not be a very pleasant experience. It might be a bit painful experience, but I think having that experience of being abroad and like living somewhere else is still really valuable. And if you sort of try and make the effort and speak with somebody of the place you're moving to, find out about the culture, about the languages and things, that you can maybe like make a smarter decision of, is this the place where I want to go? But I think even if it doesn't necessarily work out, the worst thing, you move back, you go back home, and then you have that experience, and can take that back with you for the rest of your life, and have that. So.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that ability to take a risk, take a chance, and things don't work out, try a second route is absolutely great. So I completely agree with what Les said. Right, I'm very sorry, I must go because I've got somebody ringing me. So I know we're nearing the end, but I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to run off.
It's all right. This is the end. Thank you so much for coming. Your insight was really, really great, and it allowed us to understand something that we really wouldn't have otherwise. So thank you very much for coming and sharing your experience.
Yeah,
it was very nice to meet you, Leah.
Yes, nice to meet you as well. I'll ring you up if I'm ever in the UK, and please do come to Finland.
I will totally take you up on that.
Summertime, it's best in summer. And if there are more questions from the panel, I'm happy. I can provide my email. I'm super happy to answer questions about either moving specifically to Finland or other parts of continental Europe, or I have friends living in other